Welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans from the West Coast. I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, May 19th, 2024, and I'm coming to you from the new South Stand studios in Lower Pack Heights, San Francisco. We are still squarely in the dog days of the off-season. We're about 2 months away from Big Ten Media Days, which begins on July 23rd. We're less than 3 months away from the start of fall camp, which will begin in early August. Last year, fall camp started on August 3rd. I think it'll probably start around that time as well this year. Now, it's been a minute since our last pod, nearly 4 months. And when last we spoke, Bill O'Brien had just been named Ohio State's offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach. But as we know, after only 3 weeks in Columbus, O'Brien left to take the head coaching job at Boston College. As has been well documented by now, former UCLA head coach and Ryan Day mentor Chip Kelly signed a 3-year deal to replace O'Brien as the OC and quarterbacks coach. The consensus view on Kelly, which I agree with, is he is a better fit in Columbus than O'Brien. Kelly will be, I think, much more in tune with the type of offense Ryan Day will want to run this season, which I think will be much more run-oriented than it has been in the last several years. You've got a backfield with Trevion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, two former all-conference players. Trevion Henderson was first-team All-Big Ten last year. Quinshon Judkins, first-team All-SEC. And then you got a big strapping dude at quarterback in Will Howard, who, adjusting for sack yardage, has rushed for nearly 1,100 yards and 19 rushing touchdowns in his career. So let's do a quick reset on the offseason for the Buckeyes. Now, between the winter and spring transfer portal windows, the program had 25 outgoing transfers from the 2023 roster. And at first blush, one might think, hey, pretty rough offseason for the Buckeyes. 18 of those players left during the winter transfer window, and they included most notably quarterback Kyle McCord, who's now at Syracuse, receiver Julian Fleming, who's now at Penn State, and running back Chip Trainum, who's now at Kentucky. Now, only 7 kids transferred out during the spring window, and really the only player of note, I think, was running back Dallin Hayden, who's now at Colorado. I was personally stunned that Ryan Day was able to hang on to all 5 of his scholarship quarterbacks. I mean, I thought for sure between Devin Brown and Lincoln Kienholz, at least one of them would have transferred out this spring, but they'll both be around for fall camp, and I think it's probably a good thing to have that depth. Now, on the other side of the ledger, Ohio State, as we know, added 6 major impact players from this transfer portal in the winter, which included superstar safety Caleb Downs, center Seth McLaughlin, and blue-chip quarterback prospect Julian Sayin, all from Alabama. The Buckeyes also added running back Quinshon Judkins, I just mentioned him, from Ole Miss, and quarterback Will Howard from Kansas State, who I also just mentioned. Howard is the presumptive starter. Finally, the Buckeyes added tight end Will Kazmarek from Ohio University, who I think will start at tight end for the Buckeyes coming out of fall camp. And Downs, who was the number 1 rated player in the transfer portal, and Judkins, as I've mentioned, were both first-team All-SEC selections last season. Finally, this past week, the Buckeyes added South Carolina transfer Keenan Nelson Jr. Nelson Jr. is expected to add some depth to a safety room that was left a little thin, with Kai Stokes, Cam Martinez, Jahad Carter, and Cedric Hawkins all transferring out this offseason. Now, we talked a lot about it in January. We also saw an unprecedented number of draft-eligible Buckeyes make commitments to return for the 2024 season. Cornerbacks Denzel Burke and Jordan Hancock, safety Lathan Ransom, defensive ends Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, defensive tackles Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton, linebacker Cody Simon, left guard Donovan Jackson, and of course, wide receiver Emeka Egbuka and running back Trevion Henderson. I mean, in those players, we're talking, I think for sure, at least 9 NFL draftees. It could be all 11. I think for sure Burke, Hancock, Ransom, Sawyer, Tuimoloau, Williams, Jackson, Egbuka, and Henderson. I think for sure all 9 of those players will be drafted. And then Cody Simon and Ty Hamilton, I think, are probably fringe draftees. But it could be that all 11 end up getting drafted. That's a huge amount of talent and returning experience for the Buckeyes. An unprecedented number, as I said, of players coming back. We've never really seen this before at Ohio State. So, you factor that in, and then you also factor in the fact that the Buckeyes landed the country's top prep player in wide receiver Jeremiah Smith, and the buzz around Smith during practices this spring was off the charts. Expectations are through the roof for Smith, who by all accounts just dominated in spring practices. And that's saying a lot because you have to think about who Smith was going against in practices. Denzel Burke, Hancock, guys like that. I am somewhat concerned about the expectations for this young player. He's only 18 years old, as talented as he is. He's at a different level now. And I am slightly worried that maybe our expectations for Smith are a little too much. Ohio State in the 2024 recruiting class also added defensive end Edric Houston, who I thought flashed in the spring game. He had a sack in that game. And quarterback Aaron Nolan. Those three players headline a 2024 freshman class that finished 5th nationally, according to 24/7 Sports. So you factor all that in. I think actually Ohio State had a pretty damn good offseason from a player personnel standpoint, despite the 25 outgoing transfers. Finally, in addition to Chip Kelly, Ohio State has 3 new additions to the coaching staff. Matt Guerrieri, who was previously defensive coordinator at Indiana. He replaces Perry Eliano as the new safeties coach. Carlos Lachlan, who was previously at Oregon, replaces Tony Alford as the new running backs coach. Lastly, James Laurinaitis was finally elevated from GA to linebackers coach in a move that was long, long overdue. Okay, there's your offseason reset. And look, the net result, I think of all those transactions I just described, is the Buckeyes are a surefire preseason top 2. There's no doubt about it. It's really a toss-up between Ohio State and Georgia. Fox's Joel Klatt and the Athletics' Ari Wasserman both have Ohio State number 1 in their post-spring top 25s. Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports has Ohio State number 2 in his rankings. Bill Conley of ESPN has Ohio State number 2 in his SP Plus rankings. And those are just a few of the experts who are projecting big, big things for the Buckeyes in 2024. So I didn't really have much of a plan for today. I just got the itch to talk into a microphone about Ohio State football this morning. So here I am. I got a short list of observations from the last few months I want to mention. Then I'll call it a day. I'm not going to cover every single facet because there's a lot to talk about with this team. Just a few observations, and then I'll let you go. I want to start with quarterback. Now, we didn't get to see a lot of either Will Howard or Devin Brown in the spring game. Only 13 pass attempts for Howard, 7 for Brown. I liked what I saw from Will Howard in the short time he was on the field, though, and I also think it was notable that he started the scrimmage with the first-team offense. Now, we're being led to believe Howard and Brown are in some sort of competition for the starting job in 2024, and I'm just not buying that. I mean, look, there is an absolute gulf of experience and production between these two quarterbacks. Howard has over 1,800 career snaps. Brown has 104. Howard has 778 career pass attempts. Brown has 28. Howard has 67 career touchdowns. Brown has 3. And, in the limited snaps we saw from Brown last season, I don't think we can say he really blew us away. I mean, first, he was billed as a dual threat quarterback, but his longest run from scrimmage last season was only 8 yards. We remember he threw a really bad pick in mop-up duty against Western Kentucky. He fumbled on the goal line against Purdue when that game was still in doubt. And then there are the injuries, starting with the injury to his throwing hand in the spring last year, and then the ankle injuries against Penn State and in the Cotton Bowl against Missouri. So there are major durability questions, I think, with Brown to go along with, some questions about his ability. And from the way the coaching staff and the Ohio State beat were talking about freshman Julian Sayin, it seems Brown is going to be in a serious battle just to be the backup this fall. Now, Sayin wasn't great in the spring game, but by all accounts, he had a really, really good spring. And he's the best pure passer of the 5 quarterbacks Ryan Day has in that room. So don't be surprised if at some point Devin Brown drops to QB3, maybe by the end of September or in early October. Will Howard is your starter this year, Buckeye fans. God forbid, if there are injuries that muck up that plan, obviously, then things change. But let's not overthink this. Will Howard is your starter in 2024. I want to talk a little bit about the Ohio State offensive line. That unit is probably the only legitimately questionable position group on the whole roster. Now, it seems Justin Fry has 4 starters he feels pretty good about. Josh Simmons at left tackle, Donovan Jackson at left guard, Seth McLaughlin, the Alabama transfer, at center, and then Josh Fryer at right tackle. I mean, that's a veteran group of seniors who've played a lot of football in their careers. I think there's probably good reason to feel good about that group. The only remaining question, though, is right guard. And it's not like Justin Fry doesn't have any viable options there. I mean, juniors Carson Hinsman and Tegra Shabola are available to him, and sophomore Luke Montgomery. All 3 of those players are squarely in the mix for that remaining starting spot. Now, Hinsman was the starter at center last season, and we remember he really, really struggled. But his natural position is guard. And, this is a kid who started 12 games and played 758 snaps last season. You have to think playing guard, he'll be more comfortable, and he already has a full year as a starting offensive lineman at Ohio State under his belt. So that seems like one viable option. Then there's Shabola, who at 6'6", 327 pounds, was a top 50 recruit in the 2022 class. Why aren't we talking more about Tegra Shabola? He's a junior. It's his time, right? So, between Hinsman, who was a top 200 player himself in the 2022 class, and Shabola, one of those has to be the answer at right guard. And if not, then there's Luke Montgomery. Now, we were told that the coaching staff was very hopeful Montgomery would seize the starting right guard spot in the spring. But by the spring game, it was Hinsman and Shabola getting all the reps with the first team. Maybe Montgomery's just not ready yet. Now, in Montgomery, we're talking about a fringe top 100 player in the 2023 class. He was rated 120 overall by 24/7 Sports. So there's no shortage of talent and ability there either. I'm just fucking annoyed, that for the second year in a row, though not to the same level of concern, I don't think, as last year, we're still talking about the offensive line as a potential weak link. And this is Ohio State. I'm just annoyed by this. I personally think it's fish or cut bait time for Justin Fry in 2024. He has a need at right guard. He's got a top 50 player, a fringe top 100 player, and another kid who started 12 games for him last year, all at his disposal. If none of those kids is able to step up to fill this void in 2024, then I think we have to point the finger squarely at Fry as the problem. Now, having said all that, I thought last year's unit, which is mostly returning intact, but with an upgrade at center in McLaughlin, played reasonably well in the games that really mattered. I'm not counting the Cotton Bowl, which didn't matter, but, against Notre Dame, Penn State, and Michigan, I thought they were good enough for the most part. I don't think the offensive line is the reason Ohio State lost the Michigan game. And I thought they played well enough in wins over Penn State and Notre Dame. So I'm not overly concerned with the offensive line. It is just a little annoying that, it's not better. Okay, let's flip over to the defense quickly. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this unit as we get closer to the season, but there is just one area I want to emphasize today, and that's becoming a more disruptive unit that creates a lot more havoc plays in 2024. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here because this is not the first time I've mentioned this area. Last year's unit finished number 3 in total defense, number 3 in defensive yards per play, and number 2 in scoring defense. It was a really, really good defense. No question about it. But given the talent on that unit, you would think they would have made more plays behind the line of scrimmage and created more turnovers. But the 2023 Ohio State defense finished with only 28 sacks, 72 tackles for loss, and a measly 11 turnovers. That sack total of 28 was tied for the lowest of the Ryan Day and Urban Meyer eras. And the 72 tackles for loss were the lowest output by an Ohio State defense since 2012. Finally, the 11 turnovers were far and away the fewest forced by an Ohio State defense during the Ryan Day, Urban Meyer, and Jim Tressel eras. I'm not even sure how far back in Ohio State history you have to go to find a Buckeye defense that forced fewer than 11 turnovers. I started doing the research today. I got as far back as 1999 and still could not find an Ohio State defense that forced fewer turnovers than last year's unit. Now, I'm going to keep looking. If I had to lay money on it, it's probably somewhere in the latter days of the Earl Bruce era or maybe the beginning of the John Cooper era that we might find a defense that was less effective in the turnover department. I mean, those were dark days in Ohio State history. But I also just looked at stats from the 1988 season, which was the worst Ohio State team of my lifetime. That was John Cooper's first year with the program. I think it was during that season that John Cooper famously complained that he had too many slow white guys. That team only won 4 games. They went 4-6-1 and still managed to force more turnovers, 14, than last year's defense. You've just added Caleb Downs to a unit that returns Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock, Lathan Ransom, Davison Igbinosun, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton, Sonny Styles, and Cody Simon. The list goes on. You have an eraser on the back end in Downs with an excellent veteran box safety in Ransom. You have 4 future NFL corners in Burke, Igbinosun, Hancock, and I'm even going to count Jermaine Matthews in that group. All 4 of those guys can hold up in man coverage. The Buckeyes opened the season with Akron, Western Michigan, Marshall, and Michigan State. I think the defense should be able to surpass last year's turnover total by the end of September. I mean, they should have 11 turnovers in the bag by the time they take the field against Iowa on October the 5th. Now, for reference, and I understand we're talking about different eras. Ohio State's last 2 national championship teams, 2014 and 2002, had defenses that made a shit ton of plays behind the line of scrimmage and forced a lot of turnovers. The 2014 unit had 45 sacks, 110 tackles for loss, and forced 33 turnovers. In 2002, that defense finished with 40 sacks, 100 tackles for loss, and forced 30 turnovers. Now, some are going to argue that we're in a different era of college football that favors offense, and replicating those numbers in today's game is much more difficult than it was back then. Now, to that I say, just 5 years ago, under the current head coach, Ohio State finished with more sacks and tackles for loss than the last 2 title-winning teams. And that was in 2019. The Ohio State defense finished with 54 sacks and 124 tackles for loss. That unit also finished with 25 turnovers. So it can be done in the modern era of football, being a very, very disruptive defense that makes a lot of plays behind the line of scrimmage and forces turnovers. So that's what I'm setting as the benchmark for the 2024 defense. It's those numbers from 2002, 2014, 2019. I think Ohio State this year, that defense needs to be well over 40 sacks. It's got to be over 100 tackles for loss. And I think we need to be talking about in the neighborhood of 30 turnovers forced by the 2024 defense. That's the benchmark. I think it's totally fair. I mean, if you look at the personnel that's coming back, I mean, I heard Doug Lesmerises say this a couple of weeks ago. We're probably talking about a defensive unit that's 22 deep. If you consider the type of talent that will be playing reserve roles this season, like, Jermaine Matthews, Calvin Simpson, Hunt, Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, Mitchell Melton, and Gabe Powers. I mean, with that level of talent, just in the 2 deep, right? And let alone the guys that'll be starting and playing most of the snaps who I've already mentioned, Jim Knowles should be able to take more risks, right? He should be able to mix up his fronts and his coverages and have a much more disruptive defense than last year. There's really no excuse for it. Okay, that's going to do it for me. Look for another pod from us in the coming weeks. I'm going to bring on Paige and Chad for our next pod. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and visit our website at southstandsosu.com.